Schönbrunn was never meant to be a private retreat in the modern sense. It was a seasonal capital, a place where the Habsburg court could move its entire machinery, servants, ministers, guards, musicians, cooks, scribes, into a setting that looked effortless, while running on strict schedules. Summer at Schönbrunn wasn't leisure, it was governance performed in sunlight. Decisions that shaped Central Europe could be made in rooms designed to make those decisions look inevitable. The palace's Baroque architecture functions like a language of power. Long, symmetrical facades, repeated windows, and ceremonial axes communicate order before anyone speaks. The building teaches visitors how to approach authority. Straight lines, controlled views, measured distance. Even the famous yellow tone, instantly recognizable today, reads like a deliberate uniform, warm, luminous, and impossible to ignore. The message is consistent. The dynasty is stable. The state is organized, and the ruler sits at the center of a carefully arranged world. Inside, rooms don't simply display wealth. They choreograph hierarchy. The progression from one chamber to the next is a lesson in proximity to power. Who may pass, who must wait, who is seen, who remains invisible. Staterooms are staged like theatres, with ceilings and walls turning politics into spectacle. Gilded details, mirrors multiplying light, paintings transforming family history into myth. Court etiquette becomes a physical system. Doors, thresholds, and sight lines decide what a person can do long before they decide what they want. Schönbrunn's identity is tightly bound to the era when imperial life reached its most structured form. Under rulers who understood ceremony as a weapon, the palace became a workshop of legitimacy. Audiences, receptions, and dinners were never merely social. They were calibrated events where the empire displayed itself to diplomats and nobles, reminding everyone that access to the monarch was a privilege controlled by rules. A single invitation, a seat at the right table, or a brief conversation in a corridor could carry more political weight than a formal document. The gardens extend the palace's authority outward into nature. They are not wild greenery surrounding a house. They are nature redesigned to match imperial logic. Paths aligned, hedges shaped, vistas planned. The experience is guided even when it feels like freedom. You walk and the landscape keeps placing the palace behind you. Beside you, then in front of you again, as if reminding you that the dynasty's presence is inescapable. The garden becomes a second palace, made of air and geometry instead of stone and plaster. From higher points, the complex reveals its deeper intention. It is built to be seen and to see. Elevated structures, long sight lines, and carefully placed focal points turn the entire estate into a controlled panorama. The city is near enough to be governed and far enough to be kept at a distance. This is what a summer residence means in imperial terms. A space where the ruler can step away from urban pressure while still holding the realm in view, visually and administratively. Daily life here required an industrial level of coordination. Kitchens ran like factories, stables functioned like logistics hubs, and servants moved through back corridors that kept the illusion intact. The court's smooth elegance depended on invisible labour. Laundry, repairs, candles, deliveries, security checks. Even entertainment was strategic. Music, theatre, and carefully chosen, relaxed moments signalled cultural superiority, suggesting that the empire could afford refinement because it possessed control. Schönbrunn also absorbed the tension of a dynasty living with constant risk. Succession crises, rival courts, wars, and the slow pressure of modern change. A palace like this is not only a home, it is a fortress of reputation. When threats rose, the palace's ritualized calm became more important, not less. Authority had to look calm to remain believable. The more uncertain the world outside, the more carefully the inside had to appear perfectly arranged. Today, the palace is read as beauty and heritage, but its original function still leaks through the decor. The grand rooms and gardens make sense as art, yet they were designed as instruments, tools for managing people, projecting hierarchy and turning rule into something that felt natural. Schönbrunn's summer residence identity is essentially this. Not escape from power, but power made graceful, power disguised as comfort, power displayed as tradition. Baroque splendor at Schönbrunn is not just decoration spread across walls and ceilings. It is a political language built to overwhelm the eye and steady the mind at the same time. Symmetry, repetition, gilded surfaces, and choreographed light create the sensation that everything is ordered, intentional, and stable. The visitor is pulled into a world where power looks natural, where hierarchy seems elegant rather than imposed, and where the empire's authority feels as if it belongs to the architecture itself. Imperial taste in this setting is less about personal luxury than about controlled display. Every surface signals that the dynasty possesses resources, artisans, and time. Three things ordinary states rarely have in abundance. Mirrors multiply space and brightness, turning rooms into performances of abundance. Painted ceilings lift the gaze upward into myth and allegory, where Habsburg power is recast as destiny. Even the silence of these rooms can feel deliberate, as if the building expects reverence before conversation begins. Maria Theresa's court turned this aesthetic system into a working engine of rule. Her reign depended on convincing elites and foreign observers that Habsburg authority would endure despite immense pressures. The court's rituals, audiences, receptions, dinners, dances were not distractions from politics, but instruments of it. At Schönbrunn, ceremony became a form of governance, a way to distribute favour, confirm rank, and remind everyone that access to the centre of power was controlled step by step. The golden age feeling often associated with her court comes from how completely these spaces were made to function. This was not a museum palace designed to be admired from a distance. It was inhabited, scheduled, and constantly activated by staff, musicians, servants, guards, and administrators. A day could contain negotiations, family decisions, state correspondence, and staged leisure that reassured the court that the world was still coherent. The splendour was not a background. It was an environment that trained behaviour. How to speak, how to wait, how to be seen. Style also carried a message of discipline. Baroque art can look theatrical, but at Schönbrunn it is tightly controlled theatre. The palace does not explode with randomness. It organises abundance into strict patterns. That visual discipline mirrors the ideal the court wanted to project. That the state could absorb complexity, diverse lands, languages, interests, without losing control. In this way, taste becomes ideology. A well-designed room becomes a model of how an empire imagines itself. Maria Theresa's court sharpened the palace's function as a diplomatic instrument. Foreign envoys and visiting nobles were not simply welcomed, they were guided through a sequence of impressions. Rooms expand and compress. Light changes. Symbols repeat. Portraits and allegories present a family narrative in which the dynasty is ancient, legitimate, and blessed with continuity. The The court's social choreography ensured that visitors felt the empire's hierarchy physically. Who walked nearest to the sovereign, who spoke first, who waited longest, who was allowed into the most intimate spaces. Behind the scenes, the splendour depended on relentless administration. Finances, supply chains, household management, and protocol enforcement kept the illusion seamless. Servants moved through corridors designed to keep labour invisible. Deliveries arrived on time, so banquets could appear effortless. Repairs were constant because a surface that looks eternal requires maintenance. This hidden machinery mattered politically because the court's credibility rested on appearing capable of control. Disorder behind the curtain could become disorder in the realm. The result is that Baroque grandeur at Schönbrunn feels less like excess and more like strategy. The palace teaches the viewer how an empire wants to be perceived: stable, cultivated, orderly, and inevitable. Maria Theresa's court transformed taste into a form of authority, using beauty to discipline the gaze and ritual to discipline society. What looks like ornament becomes evidence of command, and what looks like comfort becomes a carefully staged claim to legitimacy. Architecture at Schönbrunn operates as a form of argument. Walls, axes, and proportions present authority as something visible and measurable. The palace does not persuade through words, it persuades through alignment. Long facades establish rhythm, repeated windows imply surveillance and order, and the sheer scale frames power as permanent rather than personal. Visitors learn where power resides by how the building positions them, how far they stand, how they approach, how their movement is slowed and shaped. Control begins with approach. Straight ceremonial lines draw the eye forward, limiting choice and encouraging submission to a single direction. Elevation separates ruler from ruled without overt barriers, turning height into hierarchy. Thresholds are frequent and deliberate. Doors, antechambers, and staircases segment access into stages. Advancement is gradual, never sudden. Architecture turns permission into a spatial experience, reinforcing that authority is granted, not taken. Inside, rooms perform governance. The sequence of chambers orders time and attention, while ornament directs the gaze towards symbols of dynastic legitimacy. Ceilings lift narratives upward, floors guide bodies along prescribed paths. Sound, light, and scale are calibrated so that speech feels public or private by design. Political power appears calm because the building absorbs tension, distributing it across surfaces and distances. The gardens extend this logic beyond walls. Nature is not allowed to remain neutral. It is trained to speak the same language as the palace. Paths are straight or symmetrically curved, hedges clipped to uniform heights, vistas aligned with architectural focal points. The result is a landscape that feels open yet controlled. Freedom is offered as a sensation, while movement remains predictable. The garden teaches obedience without commands. Water features, terraces, and parterres organize attention in layers. From certain points, the palace dominates the view. From others, it reappears unexpectedly, reasserting presence. Elevation changes choreographed perspective, reminding visitors that power watches as much as it is watched. The garden becomes a device for managing sight lines, who sees what and when, transforming leisure into a subtle rehearsal of hierarchy. Beauty functions as discipline. Orderly nature suggests moral order, implying that authority brings harmony rather than coercion. This aesthetic claim matters politically. A ruler who can impose symmetry on living landscapes presents governance as cultivation, not conquest. The absence of wildness becomes a promise. that chaos can be managed, difference integrated, and abundance regulated without visible force. Gardens also manage time. Seasonal cycles are anticipated, not endured. Bloom schedules, maintenance rhythms, and ceremonial uses align with court calendars, turning natural change into predictable display. This mastery over seasonality reinforces the impression that power extends beyond human affairs into the rhythms of the world itself. What looks ephemeral is sustained by planning, labour, and protocol. The integration of palace and garden completes the statement. Architecture commands, landscape confirms, stone establishes authority, greenery normalizes it. Together they create an environment where power feels comprehensive and benevolent, visible yet restrained. Movement, vision, and sensation are guided so thoroughly that control becomes an experience rather than an instruction. The Gloriette sits on the hill like a deliberate punctuation mark at the end of Schönbrunn's garden axis. From below, it reads as ornament, a classical arcaded structure placed for beauty. From above, it behaves like a command post for the eyes. The palace, the parterres, the long straight lines of the grounds. Everything funnels toward that height, where Vienna spreads out beyond the trees. The view is not an accident of landscape, it is a designed sensation that makes the world feel arranged and legible. Elevation changes what power feels like. Looking down from the Gloriette, the garden becomes geometry and the palace becomes a centerpiece, as if the dynasty has mastered not only politics, but perspective itself. Distance turns complexity into pattern. Streets and rooftops dissolve into a calm surface. The city, with all its noise and unpredictability, appears manageable. That shift is one of the oldest tricks of authority, to rise above the crowd and make the mess below look orderly. Those imperial views mattered because courts lived on performance. Rulers were expected to be seen, but also to see. A vantage point like the Gloriette suggests a sovereign who surveys rather than reacts, who understands the realm as a whole rather than being trapped inside its daily friction. Even when used for leisure, the symbolism remains. A walk uphill, a pause under arches, a slow turn toward the city. These gestures create a theatre of calm command. Back inside the palace, everyday life operated on the opposite principle. Not distance, but closeness controlled by rules. Court protocol was a machine that regulated who could approach the monarch when and under what conditions. Rank wasn't an abstract title. It was measured in access. An antechamber could be a political border. Waiting could be a sign of favour or a quiet humiliation. The palace's layout supported this system perfectly, separating private corridors from public routes, and turning movement into a hierarchy you could physically feel. Routine at court began early and moved with relentless precision. Dressing was rarely private, because clothing itself was part of status and ceremony. Messages arrived, audiences were scheduled, and servants flowed through the building like an invisible current, keeping rooms warm, candles ready, uniforms clean, and corridors silent. Food was timed, music rehearsed, carriages prepared, guards rotated. The outward impression was effortless elegance, but behind it stood constant coordination, an entire workforce making power look natural. Social life was never merely social. A conversation at the right moment could decide careers. A seat at a dinner table could signal political alignment. Dances, concerts, and hunts functioned as stages where loyalties were tested and rivalries measured. People learned to read tiny signals: who spoke first, who was interrupted, who laughed too loudly, who was allowed to stand close. court life trained elites in self-control, because one mistake could become gossip, and gossip could become policy. The gloriette's calm panorama and the palace's tense choreography belonged to the same system. One produced the feeling of mastery from above. The other produced obedience through rules below. The court needed both. It needed the symbolic image of a ruler who sees everything, and it needed the daily discipline that ensured nobody acted as if they were equal to that ruler. In this sense, leisure and protocol were not opposites. They were different languages for the same message. Even the simplest routines were political. The timing of a departure, the order of a procession, the choice of where to appear in public, these details told observers whether the dynasty felt secure or threatened. In stable times, the court could afford elegance and openness. In tense times, protocol tightened, access narrowed, and silence became more valuable than spectacle. The palace absorbed those shifts quietly, because its design was built for controlled flexibility. Many rooms, many thresholds, many ways to regulate contact without ever admitting that regulation was happening. Napoleon's presence at Schönbrunn transformed the palace from a stage of dynastic confidence into a mirror of continental crisis. When French forces entered Vienna, the palace that had once embodied Habsburg continuity became a temporary headquarters for a rival vision of Europe. Rooms designed for ceremony and controlled access were repurposed for strategy, negotiation, and calculation. War did not batter the palace from outside alone. It entered quietly, occupying its corridors and rewriting the meaning of its spaces. Schönbrunn's architecture, built to project stability, now framed uncertainty. Long galleries and grand chambers hosted military councils instead of court rituals. Maps replaced genealogies as objects of focus. The palace's calm symmetry contrasted sharply with the violence unfolding across Europe, creating a dissonance that sharpened its political significance. The very order of the building made Napoleon's presence more striking. Conquest expressed not through destruction, but through occupation. For the Habsburgs, Schönbrunn under Napoleon symbolized enforced vulnerability. The palace that once staged imperial authority now staged submission and negotiation. Diplomatic meetings held within its walls carried the weight of defeat without needing explicit gestures of humiliation. Power was communicated through who controlled the space, who set the timetable, and who waited. Schönbrunn's ceremonial logic, so carefully developed to affirm Habsburg dominance, was turned against its creators. Napoleon understood the value of symbolic environments. He did not treat Schönbrunn as a random residence, but as a tool. Operating from a palace synonymous with imperial tradition allowed him to present himself as a successor rather than an outsider. By inhabiting the spaces of Habsburg authority, he implied continuity under new leadership. The palace became a visual argument. Europe's old order hadn't vanished, it had been absorbed. The personal dimension of Napoleon's stay deepened this transformation. Schönbrunn wasn't only a military base, it became the setting for intimate political decisions, with long-term consequences. The marriage between Napoleon and Marie-Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis I, tied the palace directly to a new dynastic experiment. Private rooms hosted conversations that reshaped alliances, turning Schönbrunn into a place where bloodlines were redirected, rather than erased. Daily life within the palace shifted under occupation. Servants adapted to new hierarchies, languages, and routines. Protocol did not disappear, it was rewritten. French officers moved through corridors once governed by Habsburg etiquette, introducing different rhythms of command. The palace's ability to absorb this change without collapsing into chaos revealed its deeper function as a flexible instrument of rule, capable of serving multiple regimes without altering its physical form. Schönbrunn's gardens and vistas took on new meaning as well. Views once designed to affirm Habsburg oversight now framed a Europe in flux. From elevated points, the city and surrounding landscape appeared unchanged, even as political borders were redrawn. That contrast reinforced a central truth of Napoleonic warfare. Empires could be dismantled quickly, but the structures that symbolized them endured, waiting to be reinterpreted. Napoleon's time at Schönbrunn left a layered legacy. The palace became a witness to the moment when revolutionary warfare collided with dynastic tradition. Its rooms absorbed the tension between old legitimacy and new authority, between inherited power and earned dominance. European wars did not merely pass through Schönbrunn, they reshaped how its spaces were read, turning a summer residence of certainty into a silent record of imperial transition. Schönbrunn was built to make authority feel permanent. In the Imperial era, its rooms were not spaces to admire, but spaces that organized access, rank, and obedience. The palace worked like a seasonal engine of state. Ceremonies, audiences, and court routines turned architecture into political theatre. When the Habsburg monarchy collapsed in 1918, that logic did not vanish overnight. Yet, the building's purpose had to be rewritten, because a palace designed for absolute monarchy suddenly belonged to a republic. The shift from dynastic property to public heritage changed the meaning of every corridor. What had once been controlled space, where entry depended on status, became interpretable space, where entry depends on tickets, rules, and conservation limits. The palace did not lose its aura of hierarchy, it turned that aura into narrative. Visitors now walk through the same sequences of rooms that once measured proximity to power. But the lesson has changed. Not how to approach a ruler, but how a ruling system shaped everyday life and politics through design. Modern Schönbrunn is managed as a working institution, not a frozen relic. A dedicated company, wholly owned by the Republic of Austria, was established in 1992 to run the palace and grounds as a professional operation, balancing public access with long-term preservation. This matters because the palace is not maintained simply by nostalgia. It is maintained by a permanent system. Budgets, technical departments, restoration schedules, and strict choices about materials, surfaces, and allowable change. UNESCO inscription intensified that responsibility by turning Schönbrunn into a site with international obligations. The palace and gardens of Schönbrunn were inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1996, recognized as an exceptional Baroque ensemble. That label is not just prestige, it frames the palace as a shared cultural asset, meaning conservation is expected to protect authenticity and integrity while still keeping the site legible and accessible to the public. Today's Schönbrunn is also a machine for handling scale. The palace and its wider complex draw millions of visitors, which creates a constant tension. People come precisely because the rooms and gardens feel authentic. But heavy use can wear down the very fabric they came to see. The result is a modern form of court control. Timed admissions, guided flows, protected surfaces and routes that quietly manage crowds the way protocol once managed courtiers, by directing movement without making the direction feel like a command. The museum experience itself is designed to keep the palace's old political language audible. Tours and curated rooms emphasize how power was staged. Who waited, who entered, who was watched, who served. Even without reenactors, the building does the interpretation through space. Anterooms that slow you down, grand chambers that widen your gaze, and long sequences that make authority feel like a journey rather than a moment. This is why Schönbrunn remains such a strong symbol. It doesn't just show history, it physically demonstrates how history operated. Outside, the gardens function as Vienna's most elegant paradox. Disciplined nature that feels like freedom. Paths, axes, and vistas still pull the palace into view, reminding visitors that this landscape was designed to express order. Yet the park is also lived in, walked, photographed, revisited, so imperial control is continuously reabsorbed into everyday public life. The palace no longer separates ruler and subject. It hosts citizens and visitors in spaces that once enforced distance, turning former privilege into shared experience. Schönbrunn's modern power lies in that transformation. It remains a visual shorthand for Habsburg authority, but it also represents Austria's ability to convert absolute monarchy into public memory without erasing the discomfort of hierarchy. UNESCO status, modern management, and mass visitation do not dilute the palace's meaning. They add new layers to it. The building still performs, only now it performs the story of how power can be displayed, challenged, inherited, and finally re-owned by the public.